She stood in front of me, her eyes cold, arms crossed. I still remember the sound of her voice. It didn't shake. It didn't tremble. It just cut right through me like a blade that had been waiting years to be used. "Mom, you've become a burden. I can't keep you here anymore." At first, I thought I had heard her wrong. My daughter, the same girl I held in my arms through countless sleepless nights, the one I protected from the darkness of the world, the one I gave up my life for. That girl now looked at me like I was an old couch taking up too much space in her living room. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, still holding a dish towel, my hands trembling, my heart beating so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out, because deep down, some part of me had been fearing that day for a long time. Not because of something she said, but because of everything she didn't. The looks, the silence, the way she stopped sitting with me at the table, the way she turned her face when I walked into the room. I used to believe those were just the side effects of stress, of modern life. But that afternoon, everything became clear. I was no longer her mother. I was no longer anything but a responsibility, a task she didn't ask for, a reminder of everything she felt she had to carry. The living room was quiet. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. But inside that silence, my world was collapsing. I thought of my husband, how I stood by him for 42 years. I thought of the nights I cried silently into my pillow while he lost parts of himself to disease. And I thought of how I always told myself that when he was gone, I'd at least have her. My daughter. My Emily. The same Emily who was now telling me I no longer belonged. My knees buckled a little, but I didn't fall. Not yet. I remember gripping the edge of the table, grounding myself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could say that to me after everything I did for her, after everything I gave up. But my voice, the one that used to sing her lullabies and whisper comfort into her ears when she was afraid of the dark, had no place in this moment. It had grown too soft, too small. It didn't matter anymore. And so I just nodded, not because I agreed, but because sometimes, when your heart is breaking, nodding is the only thing your body remembers how to do. She didn't cry, not even a hint of regret. She just turned her back and went upstairs, leaving me standing in a house I had helped pay for, surrounded by memories I no longer had permission to keep. It was raining that day. Of course it was. The kind of rain that sticks to your skin and sinks into your bones. The kind that turns warm sidewalks into cold betrayal. I stood outside with 2 bags. Not suitcases. Just plastic grocery bags filled with the only things I had managed to grab before she told me I had to leave. A sweater. A bottle of aspirin. My husband's photo. There was no goodbye. No, "I'll check on you later." Not even a ride to the shelter. She closed the door behind me like you would close a drawer full of things you don't want to look at anymore. Just shut. Just like that. I remember walking slowly down the sidewalk, not really knowing where I was going. My shoes were soaked within minutes. Cars passed by. No one looked. No one ever does. An old woman with wet clothes and shaking hands. No one stops for that. No one wants to see that. Because seeing it means imagining their own mother in that place. And most people can't live with that image. I passed by the bakery on the corner. The smell of bread still warm from the oven hit me like a memory. That used to be our Sunday ritual. Emily and I would go there when she was little. She'd point at the pastries, eyes full of joy. I would hold her hand tight, making sure she was safe. That memory hit me so hard I had to sit on the curb. I was still holding the photo of my husband. It was bent now, a little wet, but his smile, it was still there. I wanted to believe that somewhere, somehow, he could see me, that he knew, that he would be waiting for me on the other side, asking me why I let myself be broken like this. But I wasn't ready to answer that question. Not yet. Because in that moment, I still believed that maybe, just maybe, Emily would change her mind, that she would open the door and call my name, that this was just a mistake. But the door never opened again. I slept on a park bench that night. The air was heavy and thick. The wood was wet and I had no blanket. Every sound made me flinch. Every gust of wind felt like another slap from life. I curled up as best I could, clutching that photo like it could protect me, like maybe it could speak for me when I no longer had words. I wasn't crying, not because I wasn't sad, but because I had already cried everything I had left. This wasn't sorrow. This was something deeper. This was being erased. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Emily hugged me without obligation. I couldn't. I tried to remember the last time she laughed at something I said. Nothing. All I could see was her back, walking up the stairs, leaving me behind. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had nowhere to go. Nowhere. No one. Just 2 bags and a heart that still believed it had a place in someone's home. But that night, something inside me shifted. Not hope, not yet. Something quieter. The beginning of something I wouldn't understand until much later. The tiniest whisper of survival. My name is Dolores Maria Thompson. I'm 68 years old, and if you saw me walking down the street, you probably wouldn't look twice. I'm that older woman with silver hair always tied back neatly, wearing worn-out sneakers and a long skirt. I sell cornbread and sweet rolls at the corner of 12th Street Market every Saturday. Sometimes I sweep the leaves from the church courtyard, arrange the folding chairs before service, and bring coffee to the elderly brothers who still wear their Sunday suits, even in the heat of Jackson, Mississippi. People greet me with kindness, but no one ever asks where I sleep at night. And I don't offer the truth. I live in a small room behind the church pantry. It used to be a storage closet before Pastor Ellen gave it a coat of paint and cleared a space for a narrow cot. The walls still smell faintly of bleach and damp wood. There's a chipped mirror nailed above a plastic dresser where I keep my 3 dresses, 1 cardigan, a pair of socks, and the small framed photo of my husband that I move from the dresser to my pillow every night. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, unsure of where I am. It takes me a few seconds to remember I'm not in her house anymore, that I don't need to ask permission to breathe, that I don't need to apologize for every step I take. But even now, when I boil water for tea or fold my sheets with careful silence, I find myself still trying not to make noise. Habits born of fear don't go away easily. People think this is a choice, that I chose to live simply, that I found God and wanted to live close to faith. And maybe now, after everything, I do feel closer to something divine, but not because I went searching for it. No, I ended up here because I was discarded. I didn't arrive at this life with wisdom in my hands. I arrived with nothing, not even shoes fit for walking. There's a woman who sells vegetables next to my stall at the market. Her name is Gloria. She's in her early 40s, full of life, always joking with customers. Sometimes she gives me extra tomatoes at the end of the day. Once, she asked me where I go when the market closes. I smiled and said, "Where the Lord guides me." She laughed and said that was a good answer. But the truth is, I didn't want to see the pity in her eyes if I told her that home is a converted closet, and that most nights I sleep with my purse clutched to my chest just in case someone comes through the back door. I used to have a life. Not a grand one, but a full one. A life with curtains I sewed myself. A garden with hydrangeas. A kitchen where the scent of cinnamon and clove filled the air every Sunday. I was a mother, a wife, a caretaker, a woman with a purpose, even if no one ever noticed it. But that was before the world shrank around me, before my title changed from mom to burden, before people stopped saying my name and started referring to me as her. There's a bench outside the church where I sit every morning before the sun rises. I like to watch the sky turn from indigo to pale gold. That bench has become my place of remembering. I sit there and trace the pieces of my past, the parts of myself that got scattered along the way. I remember the smell of my husband's skin after a shave. I remember Emily's tiny fingers wrapping around mine when she was just a baby. I remember the quiet pride I felt when I ironed her school uniform, pressing every crease perfectly, like it meant something. And it did. I wasn't always this invisible. People used to know my name. My husband's coworkers used to ask him about my cooking. My neighbors used to stop by for a slice of pie and advice about colicky babies. I used to get birthday cards. I used to get phone calls just to say hi. But aging has a way of erasing you, especially when you no longer serve a function in someone else's life. The minute you stop being useful, The world finds ways to move on without you. I don't blame the world for that. But I never expected my own daughter to be the one to teach me how cruel that lesson could be. The strangest part is that I never asked for anything from her. Not money, not gifts, just a little space, a warm meal, the chance to sit near her while we watched the evening news. But even that became too much. I remember one night, not long before she put me out, I had made a pot of soup with the leftover vegetables I found in the fridge. I set the table like I used to, with folded napkins and warm bread. When she got home, she walked past the table without a word, went to her room, and shut the door. I sat there alone, staring at 2 untouched bowls of soup, the steam rising slowly like a final goodbye. That's the kind of silence that doesn't just break your heart, it hollows it. Some days, I find comfort in the little things. The laughter of children running past the church steps, the rustle of paper bags at the market, the way someone calls me Miss Dolores with affection, even if they don't know my story. But there's always a moment, usually late at night, when I remember what I used to be. Not in a proud way, but in a stunned way, like looking at a photograph of someone you can't quite recognize anymore. I've learned to be small, to take up less space, to make my footsteps quiet, but I wasn't born that way. Once I danced barefoot in the kitchen. Once I sang hymns while scrubbing the floor, not because I had to, but because joy was a natural part of living. I didn't used to apologize for existing. That was something I learned much later. And yet, even now, after everything, I still rise before the sun. I still make my little bed with care. I still boil tea and hum old songs under my breath, because there is a part of me, however small, that refuses to disappear. That room behind the church? It's not much, but it doesn't ask me to explain myself. It doesn't sigh when I speak. It doesn't roll its eyes when I forget where I put my glasses. It's the first space in a long time that feels like it belongs to me, even if it's borrowed. I don't decorate it. I don't need to. There is a kind of peace in its plainness, a stillness that doesn't expect anything from me, and that, more than anything, has become my salvation. People assume old age is a time for reflection, but sometimes it's a time for survival, and I've become very good at surviving. Not in the way that wins medals or applause, but in the way that lets you wake up one more day, breathe in, and keep going, even when there's no one waiting for you to wake up. I sit on that church bench each morning and I tell myself one simple thing: I am still here. Not because someone wants me to be, not because someone made space for me, but because I refuse to vanish. And even if the world forgets my name, I won't. I met James in the summer of 1977, back when love still felt like something that could protect you from the world. He was tall, with hands that looked like they could build houses, and a laugh that made everything around him feel warmer. We met at a 4th of July church barbecue. He spilled sweet tea on my blouse and then spent the rest of the day trying to make up for it. I remember thinking his voice sounded like home, deep, steady, with just a hint of mischief. The kind of voice you want reading to you when the rain won't stop. We married the following spring. I wore a borrowed dress and he wore the same brown suit he had for years, one size too big. We didn't have much, but we had dreams. We wanted a house with a porch, a little garden, maybe 2 children. I wanted to teach Sunday school. He wanted to open a car repair shop. None of that seemed impossible back then. We were young, hopeful, broke, but determined. At first, life was sweet. James worked long hours at a tire shop, and I worked part-time at the library shelving books. We'd come home, cook together, dance barefoot in the kitchen. There were fights, of course, but never anything we couldn't fix with an apology and a kiss. We built a life out of hand-me-downs and second chances, and for a while, that was enough. But then came the first stroke. It happened in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of his breathing, loud, uneven. His right side was limp. His words came out slurred. I called the ambulance with shaking hands. I remember the way the lights from the siren filled our bedroom with red, blue, red, blue. That was the night everything changed. He recovered mostly, but he was never the same. The man who used to carry me into the kitchen jokingly after long days now needed help buttoning his shirt. At first, I told myself it was temporary. just a bump in the road. But as months passed, more symptoms appeared. His hands started to shake. He struggled to hold a fork. His memory flickered in and out, like a bulb that couldn't decide whether it still worked. The doctors said, Parkinson's. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. All I knew was that the man who once stood tall beside me now leaned on me for everything. The dreams we'd built so carefully began to unravel, thread by thread. The car repair shop idea vanished. My part-time job had to go too. He couldn't be left alone, not even for an hour. I became his full-time caretaker before I ever knew what that title meant. Caring for someone you love is not noble the way people romanticize it. It's not soft piano music and warm light. It's exhaustion. It's frustration. It's loving someone so deeply that you burn yourself down trying to keep their fire alive. There were days I woke up with his name already on my lips because I had fallen asleep mid-sentence the night before, giving him his medication. There were nights I didn't sleep at all, just sat on the edge of the bed watching his chest rise and fall, wondering if I would wake up next to a body and not a husband. People stopped visiting. It wasn't their fault. Illness makes people uncomfortable. They don't know what to say when the man they once knew can no longer speak without drooling. When his body moves in jerks and twitches. They don't know what to say to the woman who used to bake pies for every neighborhood picnic, but now smells faintly of antiseptic and lives in a house full of pill bottles. So they just drift away. And so it became just us. I got good at things I never wanted to be good at. Changing adult diapers, turning him over every 2 hours to prevent bed sores, crushing pills and mixing them into applesauce, speaking gently even when I was so tired my bones hurt, smiling through gritted teeth when he forgot my name for the 3rd time that week. There was no room for grief, no room for anger, only routines. Wake him, clean him, feed him, help him to the bathroom, help him back, read to him, play old music that used to make him smile, hope that maybe today he'll look at me with some flicker of recognition. Sometimes he did. Most times he didn't. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the diabetes came. It snuck in like a thief in the night, stealing the last bits of strength he had. His legs began to swell. His feet went numb. The doctors warned me about infections, ulcers, amputations. I started washing his feet with warm salt water every evening, whispering prayers under my breath, as if my words could keep his body from falling apart. I gave up everything to care for James. My hair turned gray before its time. My hands became dry and cracked from scrubbing, cleaning, folding. My knees ached from lifting his weight over and over again. My back developed a constant dull pain that no pill could touch. But I never stopped. Not once. Even when the days blurred together. Even when the nights felt endless. Even when I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Even then, I stayed. Because that's what you do when you love someone. Or at least, that's what I believed. I used to keep a little notebook on the nightstand. Every night after he was asleep, I'd write one sentence. Just one. A record of the day. Sometimes it was as simple as, he smiled today, or he ate the whole bowl of soup. Other nights it was, he called me mama again, or he tried to walk and fell hard. That notebook was the only place I told the truth. It became my confession booth, my therapist, my proof that I was still trying. I never told Emily about the notebook. She visited sometimes. Not often. She said the house made her sad. Said she didn't like seeing her father like that. I understood. I didn't like seeing him like that either. But I didn't have the option to leave. I was the one who stayed behind after everyone else moved on. She'd come for a birthday or a holiday, sit stiffly on the couch, scrolling through her phone between half-hearted conversations. I'd cook something special, try to make the house smell like cinnamon and familiarity, but she never stayed long. Always had somewhere else to be, some appointment, some emergency, something that wasn't me. I used to think she was just busy, that she loved us in her own way, that maybe one day she'd come around and realize how hard I was trying to keep everything together. But time has a way of stripping illusions, especially when you're the one doing all the work. James got worse. His body failed him. His mind wandered farther and farther away. There were days he called me by his mother's name. Other days he spoke to the wall, asking it to take him home. One morning, I found him unresponsive. He had slipped away quietly in his sleep. I sat beside him for hours before I called anyone. I just needed time. Time to say goodbye to the man I loved. Time to mourn not just his death, but the decades we had lost to illness. Time to breathe as a woman and not just a caretaker. When they took his body away, I felt both empty and relieved. And then I waited for my daughter to come. For once she did. She arrived with tears in her eyes and flowers in her hands. She hugged me and said all the right things. That I had been brave. That I had done more than anyone could have. That I deserved rest now. I believed her. I thought, maybe finally, she would see me again. But I didn't know then that the loss of my husband would only be the first abandonment. The second was still coming. And it would hurt even more. Emily came into this world on a night soaked in thunder and fire. The sky roared with such anger. I remember thinking God must have been making room for something big. I was 32, and James had driven me to the hospital in his old rusted truck, gripping the steering wheel like it was holding him together. My contractions had started earlier that day, but I had kept quiet for hours. I didn't want to bother him, not with the shop being so busy that week. But by the time the pain came like waves crashing through my spine, there was no hiding it anymore. We reached the hospital just in time. They rushed me into the delivery room, and I still remember the fluorescent lights overhead, cold and humming, and the nurse's voice saying, "We have a breach. We might lose her." Everything after that was noise, chaos, until the silence, that stillness that only mothers know, that unbearable pause when you don't hear the cry. Just doctors moving too fast, and machines beeping, and a pressure in your chest so heavy you think your soul might leave your body right there. And then, her voice. A wail so sharp it sliced through the noise like a ribbon of light. She was alive. She was small, but loud, angry, beautiful. They placed her on my chest, and my arms wrapped around her instinctively like I had been waiting my whole life for that exact moment. She was red and wrinkled and squirming, but when I whispered her name, she went still. Emily. My Emily. Right then, I whispered a promise into her soft little ear. A vow. You'll never be alone in this world. Not while I breathe. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even planned. It just came out of me. Like the truth had been living in my bones all along. We brought her home in a crocheted blanket made by my mother. The house felt new. Alive. James painted the nursery that same week, even though his hands still trembled slightly from the last episode. We filled that tiny room with love we didn't know we had left. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't mind. Emily was colicky, cried at the drop of a pin, hated baths, and loved being rocked in the chair my grandmother gave me. That chair became my second bed, my chapel, my place of surrender. Every night, as I rocked her back and forth, I would pray over her tiny head, pray for her health, for her future, for the world to be kind. I breastfed her until she was nearly 2, not because I had to, but because I wanted her close. I remember the first time she smiled, really smiled. It wasn't gas. It was something deeper, something knowing, like she was telling me she saw me, that she knew I was hers and she was mine. When she learned to walk, she did it barefoot in the backyard, stumbling between tomato plants and laundry lines. James cried when she said Dada for the first time. He cried again when she said Mama. Everything about her felt like a miracle we didn't deserve. And as she grew, I gave her everything I could. Every sandwich packed with a note inside. Every pair of socks folded neatly in her drawer. Every bedtime story. Even the ones I had to read twice. I made her Halloween costumes by hand. I braided her hair every morning before school. I stayed up with her through fevers, broken hearts, and algebra tests. I prayed over her room every night after she fell asleep. I gave her the world I never had. When money was tight, James and I went without. He needed new boots one winter, but we bought Emily a science kit instead. He said, "She's our future. Let her build something better than we had." And she did. She won her middle school science fair 2 years in a row. We still have the ribbons, tucked inside a Bible on the bookshelf. Or at least, I think they're still there. I haven't been back in that house since the day she put me out. There was this one Christmas. We couldn't afford a tree, so I painted branches on the wall and taped paper ornaments that Emily had made. She was maybe 7 or 8. She told me it was the most magical Christmas ever. She hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack, and she whispered, "Thank you for always making things beautiful." I held on to that moment like it was gold. For years, I told myself that memory would be enough to carry me through anything. She was always bright, always sharp. She had dreams of being a writer, used to fill notebooks with stories about dragons and girls who saved the world. I used to read them after she went to sleep, with tears in my eyes, knowing she would grow up and leave, but hoping she'd always come back. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. I don't know if it was high school or college or life, but her eyes stopped lighting up the same way when she saw me. Her hugs grew shorter, her tone more clipped. The warmth didn't vanish all at once. It faded slowly, like the sun disappearing behind a cloud that never moved again. I kept showing up, even when she moved out, even when she didn't return my calls for days. I left voicemails, sent care packages, wrote letters. I believed that love, real love, didn't need to be loud to be strong, that she just needed space, that she'd come back around. When her father got worse, I asked her to visit more often. She said work was too much. I understood. I didn't want her to see him like that either, but I needed her, not just for help, but because I was breaking and didn't want to do it alone. Still, I made excuses for her. She's busy, I'd tell the neighbors. She's got a lot on her plate. I was protecting her, even when she wasn't protecting me. When James passed and she showed up crying, I thought maybe that was the reset. That maybe, in the shared loss, we could find our way back to each other. She held my hand during the service. She sat beside me in the front pew, her head bowed. She helped me pack his things, or at least stood nearby while I did it. And then one day, she said the words I thought I'd never hear. "Mom, I want you to come live with me." I said yes before she finished the sentence. I didn't ask questions. I didn't hesitate. I believed with all my heart that it was the start of something healing. I packed what little I had left, folded my clothes into a small suitcase, took my Bible, my wedding ring, a few photos, and I left the house where I had lived most of my life, the home that had seen my joys, my sorrows, my youth, and my wrinkles. I left it believing that, at last, I would rest, that the years of sacrifice had not been for nothing. She cleared out a room for me, said it would be temporary, said it was tight, but it would work. I didn't care. I would have slept on the floor if it meant being near her, being wanted. The room was small, tucked near the laundry machines. The walls were bare. The mattress was thin, but I smiled through it. I told her it was perfect. I thanked her every day. I cooked meals. I cleaned when she wasn't home. I tried to stay out of the way. I tried not to be seen, but helpful enough to be appreciated. But I could feel it. The weight, the shift, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her tone changed, the way the air in the house grew colder, not in temperature, but in presence. I had once promised her she'd never be alone in the world, but I was starting to wonder if she had promised herself that she'd never become me. And somewhere deep inside, I began to realize I might be living with her, but I was no longer home. It started with little things, small moments so quiet they were almost invisible, the kind of changes you only notice when they pile up and form something too heavy to ignore. A door not held open like it used to be. A dinner plate dropped a little louder on the table. A sigh, barely audible, when I asked for help reaching something on the top shelf. These weren't arguments. They weren't cruel words shouted in anger. They were colder than that, duller, like a knife left out in the rain, still sharp enough to cut, but too rusted to shine. At first, I blamed myself. I was grieving. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was reading into things that weren't there. I told myself that Emily was just tired. She had work, responsibilities, her own worries. She was doing her best. She let me into her home when she didn't have to. That was love, wasn't it? even if it didn't look the way I remembered. I didn't want to be a burden, so I adjusted. I woke up earlier to avoid the rush in the hallway. I timed my showers so I wouldn't use too much hot water. I cooked meals that I knew she liked, even when I wasn't hungry myself. I made myself smaller. There was one morning I'll never forget. I had gotten up early to make her favorite, French toast with cinnamon and vanilla, the way I used to make it when she was a child. The smell filled the kitchen like it always had. I even put the maple syrup in a little ceramic dish the way she liked it. When she walked in, I smiled and said, "Good morning, sweetheart." She looked at the table, blinked, and said, "Didn't we talk about not using the stove before 7 a.m.? I have early meetings, Mom. I need peace in the morning." I froze. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. But her words felt like a slap, like I had broken a rule I didn't know existed. I apologized, of course. I always did. I cleaned everything up quietly, put the French toast in a Tupperware container, and went back to my room. That breakfast sat in the fridge for 2 days before I finally threw it away. It didn't stop there. Some evenings she wouldn't speak to me at all. She'd walk past me like I was part of the furniture. Other nights, she would come home late, the scent of perfume and wine trailing behind her, and look irritated when I asked if she was okay. She started locking her bedroom door. She started closing cabinets with more force. One night, I left a tea mug in the sink. The next morning, she asked if I could try to be more mindful of keeping things tidy. It was never screaming, never violence, but it was erasure, a slow and deliberate turning away, as if each day she was convincing herself that I didn't belong there, that I was just passing through, and maybe, eventually, I would just disappear. I started to keep to my room. It was safer there. I read old books from the church library. I listened to gospel music on low volume. I knitted, though my fingers had begun to ache. I prayed. Mostly, I prayed. One night I overheard her on the phone. She thought I was asleep, but my door was cracked open just enough. Her voice was low, tired, a little bitter. "No, she's still here. I don't know for how long. I can't live like this forever. I didn't sign up to babysit an old woman." I stopped breathing. I couldn't move. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, hearing that sentence over and over again in my head. Babysit. Old woman. Still here. The next day, I cleaned the entire apartment while she was at work, top to bottom. Floors, windows, bathroom tiles. I even polished the silverware. I hoped she'd come home and smile. Maybe say thank you. Maybe remember who I was. Instead, when she walked in and saw me wiping down the kitchen counters, she frowned and said, "Did you use bleach again? I told you I'm allergic to strong smells." I apologized. I always apologized. I hadn't even used bleach, just lemon and vinegar. But it didn't matter. The offense was already written in her eyes. There was no winning. I stopped cleaning. Then I stopped cooking. Then I stopped trying. I became quiet. I stayed in my room and listened for the sound of her heels in the hallway. I timed my movements around her presence like a shadow avoiding the sun. She started coming home later, spending more time out of the house. And when she was home, she was distant, cold. She smiled at her phone more than she smiled at me. There was one afternoon, late in the fall, when I heard a knock at the door. It was her friend, Janice. They hadn't seen each other in years. They laughed in the living room, sipped wine, talked about high school memories. I stayed in my room, but then I heard Janice say something that still rings in my ears. "Oh, is your mom visiting?" And Emily said casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, "Yeah, she's just here for a little while, until she figures something out. Just visiting." I clutched my blanket like it could keep my heart from falling out of my chest. Just visiting. Not, "My mom moved in after Dad passed." Not, "She's staying with me for a while because she needs support." Just, a guest. Temporary. A woman who didn't belong. After that, everything changed even more quickly. She stopped asking if I needed anything from the store. She started leaving the house before I woke up. When I tried to speak to her, she always had her phone in her hand or a glazed look in her eyes, like I was interrupting a life I no longer had a place in. I thought about leaving. I even packed a small bag one night, just essentials. Some money I had hidden away, a few clothes, my Bible. But where would I go? I had no friends left in the city, no family. The church was far. I didn't drive anymore. And more than anything, I was afraid. Afraid of being on the street. Afraid of not being able to take care of myself. Afraid of dying alone. So I stayed. And one evening, everything shattered. It was a cold day, and I had made a pot of lentil soup. The apartment smelled warm, comforting. I set the table, hoping maybe we could share a meal like we used to. She walked in, dropped her keys in the bowl by the door, looked around and said, "Why are you always here? Don't you ever go out? Don't you have anywhere to be?" I blinked. My mouth went dry. And before I could answer, she said it. The words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "You've become a burden, Mom. I can't keep doing this. I need my life back." A burden. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She said it like someone reading off a grocery list. Calm, final. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg her to remember who I was, what I had given, what I had lost, what I had carried on my back for years so that she could run freely through the world. But I didn't. I just nodded. And in that moment, I realized something so painful I could barely breathe. I wasn't her mother anymore. I was her inconvenience. The day she told me to leave didn't come with a storm or screaming. It came quietly, like a slow leak in a pipe, unnoticed until the damage was beyond repair. I had started to feel the shift weeks before. The way she avoided eye contact when we passed each other in the hallway. The way she kept her phone pressed to her ear when I tried to speak. I used to think silence was peace. But silence, when it replaces connection, is its own kind of violence. That morning, I had washed my bedsheets and hung them over the railing on the patio to dry. It was sunny, the kind of day that reminded me of the old house, when James would whistle while fixing things and Emily would chase butterflies in the backyard. I stood on the patio for a moment longer than usual, just breathing, holding on to the memory of days that felt like they belonged to someone else. She came home early from work. I wasn't expecting her. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, and I knew something was off by the way she didn't call out, "Hey," or "I'm back." I turned from the kitchen and saw her standing with her arms crossed, staring at the laundry on the railing. "Mom," she said, not warmly, not coldly, just flat. "We need to talk." Those 4 words have ended marriages, broken friendships, and in my case, shattered the last piece of something I once called home. I dried my hands and walked toward her slowly. I sat on the edge of the couch. She didn't sit. She stood across from me, hands tight at her sides. "This isn't working anymore," she said. "I tried. I really did. But I can't do this." I stared at her, unsure if she was referring to a temporary disagreement or something else entirely. Before I could ask, she continued, "You've been here for months, and I feel like I don't have space to breathe. I come home and it doesn't feel like my home. It feels like I'm stepping into someone else's routine. I feel trapped. I don't want to feel that way in my own house." I wanted to say that I never tried to take anything from her, that I had tried to be invisible, that I scrubbed the bathroom floor with my hands, made meals I didn't eat, turned down the volume of the television so she could sleep. But I didn't say any of that. I just looked at her. She kept going. "I've looked into some options. There's a senior center on 5th. They said they might have space. Or maybe the church can help you find somewhere. But you can't stay here anymore. I need my life back, Mom. I'm drowning. Drowning." She said it like I was the water. I felt my throat closing. My eyes stayed dry, but my heart collapsed inward like a paper cup. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what else to do. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. I hadn't had a paycheck of my own in years. My savings had long since dried up, poured into James's medication, hospital visits, adult diapers, all the things that slowly replaced dignity over time. "When?" I asked. She looked surprised, maybe because I didn't argue. "I think by the end of the week." End of the week. Today was Tuesday. That night, I packed slowly. I folded everything with care, a few dresses, my Bible, my wedding band, a photograph of James in a faded frame. I sat on the bed for hours after, just holding my shoes. I kept thinking, if I stayed very still, maybe the world would freeze too, and none of it would be real. She didn't help me pack. She didn't come to check if I was okay. She was in her room, laughing at something on her phone. I could hear the muffled joy through the walls. That laughter used to be mine. I used to be the one who caused it. Now it was just proof of how far away I had drifted, even while sleeping under the same roof. On Thursday, she came home from work early again. She had a box of takeout in one hand, keys in the other. "I thought I'd drive you to the church," she said casually, like we were going to the store or a doctor's appointment. I nodded. Again. I had gotten used to nodding when my voice felt like too much. She didn't ask if I was ready. She didn't ask if I was scared. She didn't even ask if I had someone waiting for me. I carried my small suitcase and the bag with my clothes. She didn't offer to help. We walked to the car in silence. It was warm outside, but I felt cold. My bones ached, not from age, but from grief. There is a pain that comes when you realize you've been erased from someone's life while still breathing beside them. We drove in silence. The city looked different that day. Every tree, every stoplight, every passerby felt like part of a life I no longer belonged to. She parked outside the church, but didn't turn off the engine. "Do you want me to walk you in?" she asked. I shook my head. I opened the door, stepped out, and closed it gently behind me. She didn't wait for me to reach the entrance. She drove away before I had made it up the steps. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in one hand, bag in the other, and watched the taillights disappear. Inside, Pastor Ellen was kind. She had seen me in the pews before, knew I had lost James. She didn't ask questions. She showed me the storage closet they had cleaned out, told me it wasn't much, but it was safe. She gave me a blanket, a pillow, a small lamp. That night, I lay on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, tracing every crack, every stain. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from the shock of everything unraveling so fast. I thought of Emily. I thought of the baby I once held against my chest, whispering promises in the dark. I thought of the little girl who ran into my arms after school, smelling of crayons and sunshine. I thought of the teenager who once called me at midnight just to say she missed me. And I thought of the woman who left me on the steps of a church, like I was nothing. No one tells you what it feels like to be unwanted by your own child. There is no word for that pain. There is no name for that grief. That night, I cried for the first time in years, not because I was weak, but because I had finally realized no one was coming to save me. The first few days at the church were quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but instead makes your thoughts louder. Every sound echoed. My footsteps on the tile, the creak of the cot when I shifted, the scratch of pen on paper when I tried to write something, anything, just to remind myself that I was still here. I wasn't used to being alone with my thoughts. For years, my days were filled with James's breathing, medicine alarms, doctor's calls, the soft shuffle of slippers in the hallway. And then there was Emily, even if only in fragments, her keys jangling, her voice from another room, the slam of a door. Now, all of that was gone. There was only me. Pastor Ellen came to check on me each morning. She'd bring a cup of coffee, black, the way I liked it, and sit with me for a few minutes. She never pushed, never asked me to explain myself. She just sat, and somehow that was enough. Sometimes we'd talk about the weather or the sermon she was planning for Sunday. Other times we didn't talk at all. She had that kind of presence that made you feel like you didn't have to fill the silence with words. I was grateful for that. The storage room they had cleared for me had no windows. The air was always slightly stale, and the light bulb overhead buzzed like it was struggling to stay alive. But they had given me a space heater, a lamp with a soft yellow glow, and a little rug that smelled faintly of lavender. I didn't have much, but I had enough. I kept my things organized, my clothes folded neatly, my shoes aligned against the wall, my Bible placed on the crate they'd turned into a nightstand. I needed the order. It gave me something to hold on to. But the nights were hardest. That's when the memories crept in, uninvited. I'd lie on the cot, my back aching, and remember the nights I used to stay up rocking Emily in my arms. The nights I massaged James's legs when the tremors wouldn't let him sleep. The nights I sat by myself in the old house, listening to the walls creak and the wind rattle the windows, wondering if I was doing enough, being enough, loving enough. Now, I wondered if any of it had mattered. There were moments I caught myself talking aloud. To God? To James? To no one in particular. I asked the same questions over and over. How did we get here? What did I miss? When did I stop being her mother and start being a burden? One evening, after helping clean up from a community dinner, I walked past a mirror in the church hallway and didn't recognize myself. My hair had thinned more than I realized. My cheeks were hollow, my eyes dull. I leaned in close and whispered, "Who are you now?" I didn't have an answer. People in the congregation started to notice me, though no one asked much. Some would nod politely. A few brought me extra blankets or left fruit in a paper bag by my door. Little kindnesses that meant more than I could express. I began helping around the church, folding bulletins, wiping pews, organizing the pantry. I needed to be useful. I needed to feel like I still had value. That's when I met Ruth. She was in her 70s, short and strong, with silver hair and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She ran the food pantry with the precision of a general and the heart of a mother. One morning, I offered to help her stack cans. She looked me up and down, nodded once, and said, "You don't look useless to me." It was the kindest thing anyone had said in weeks. Ruth and I became a quiet team. We didn't talk about our pasts at first. We just worked side by side, finding rhythm in the routine. But one afternoon, as we sorted bags of rice, she said, "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. She told me I ruined her life. And maybe I did, but I loved her the best way I knew how." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Our stories sat between us like two chairs pulled up to the same table. Different details, same ache. Ruth gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Witness. She saw me. Not as a problem to fix or a case to manage, just as a woman trying to keep breathing. One Sunday, after service, a little girl with braids came up to me and handed me a drawing. It was a picture of me with a big red heart. She said, "You look like a grandma." I smiled so hard it hurt. I hadn't heard that word in so long. Not since Emily was in high school, dreaming of family and futures. I kept that drawing in my Bible, pressed between the pages of Psalms. But even with these small lights, the darkness lingered. Some nights I still woke up with tears already on my face. I'd dream of Emily calling out for me, like she used to when she was little, and I'd wake up reaching for her voice. My hands would find only air and the scratchy fabric of the cot. There were also nights I didn't sleep at all. I'd sit up and write in the little notebook Pastor Ellen had given me. Each entry started the same. "Dear Lord, help me hold on." Some days that was all I wrote. Other days, I poured out the things I was too afraid to say aloud. That I missed James so badly it felt like a physical wound. That I hated myself for still loving a daughter who had discarded me. That I was terrified of dying in a place where no one would notice until it was too late. And yet, every morning, I got up. I made my cot. I washed my face. I showed up at the pantry. I smiled when people walked in. I kept going. Because somewhere deep inside, under the rubble of all that had been lost, there was still a flicker of something. Something stubborn. Something sacred. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. Then, one afternoon, as I was sweeping the church kitchen, Pastor Ellen came in holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said. My name was written on the front in Emily's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a short letter. It didn't say much, just that she hoped I was okay, that she'd been busy, that she was sorry things had gotten so hard. There was no apology, no invitation, just a folded $100 bill and the sentence, "I thought this might help." I stared at it for a long time. That bill felt heavier than gold. It wasn't the money. It was what it represented. A guilt offering, a transaction, a way to soothe her conscience without addressing the wound. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it under my mattress. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Not yet. Later that night, I sat with Ruth on the church steps, watching the sun melt behind the trees. I told her about the letter. She didn't say much, just handed me a mug of tea and said, "Some people send flowers, others send silence. Take what you need and leave the rest." I nodded, sipping slowly. The wind picked up, cool and soft against my skin. For the first time in weeks, I let it touch me without shrinking away. I sat there until the stars appeared, one by one, like tiny reminders that even in the darkest skies, something will always find a way to shine. And so would I. It was early November when the weather began to change. The mornings came colder, the wind sharper, and the air held that thin edge of winter that slipped under your coat, no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. The small space I slept in at the church grew colder too. The heater hummed as best it could, but its warmth barely reached my bones. I started wearing 2 sweaters to bed, one wrapped around my legs like a blanket. Some nights I could see my own breath in the dark. The food pantry slowed down, donations came less often, fewer hands brought bread, and more hands came to ask for it. I found myself staring at the empty shelves, wondering how so many people could be falling through the cracks at the same time. There was one morning I counted 3 different mothers crying quietly as they accepted half-full bags of rice and expired cans of beans. They always said thank you. They always smiled through it. But their eyes told the truth. There's a look you learn when you've lost more than people think. I knew that look well. My body began to feel the weight of it all. I was tired in ways I hadn't been before. Not just from working or sleeping on a cot, but a deep fatigue, like my spirit was slowly shutting down. My knees hurt more when I stood. My back ached without cause. I started forgetting things. Small things at first. A name, a date, where I'd left my scarf. But then I burned a pot of rice one afternoon and didn't even notice the smell until smoke curled up around the ceiling. Pastor Ellen found me standing in the kitchen, dazed, holding a spoon that had melted at the tip. She didn't scold me. She just guided me back to my room, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, "Rest tonight." I didn't sleep. I lay there wondering what was happening to me. Was it grief? Was it age? Was it the slow erosion of a life spent in service, now crumbling under the weight of neglect? I missed James more in those weeks than ever before. I missed his quiet presence, the way he used to hold my hand even when his own trembled. I missed the way he'd hum while fixing something in the garage, the rhythm of it like a lullaby. I missed being seen, being needed, not as a task, not as a burden, but as a person. One afternoon, Ruth didn't show up at the pantry. She always arrived early, always with her thermos of coffee and her worn-out list of inventory. I waited an hour, 2. Finally, Pastor Ellen came in and told me Ruth had been taken to the hospital the night before. Something with her heart. I sat down hard on the wooden bench near the pantry door. I hadn't realized how much I'd leaned on Ruth's presence. She was the only one who knew without asking, who looked at me and saw a woman, not a problem to be solved. I felt something sharp inside me begin to crack open. Later that night, I lit a candle and prayed, not with words, but with silence. The kind of silence that says more than any sentence could. I closed my eyes and imagined Ruth's face, her steady hands, the way she'd wink when she caught me crying and pretend she didn't see. The next morning, I walked the 2 blocks to the hospital. I didn't know if they'd let me in, but I had to try. The woman at the front desk was kind. She called up to the floor and told me I could go up for a few minutes. Ruth was awake, propped up in bed, pale but smiling when she saw me. "Took you long enough," she whispered, voice scratchy but strong. I sat beside her and took her hand. It was cold, but firm. "I'm not ready to go," she said. "You're not going," I told her. We sat in silence after that, holding on. When I returned to the church, something inside me had shifted. I realized how fragile it all was, how quickly everything could be taken, how easily the people who anchor us can vanish. I couldn't afford to keep fading. I couldn't afford to keep waiting for someone else to lift me out of this. A few days later, I was organizing canned goods when I felt a sharp pain in my side. I doubled over, gripping the edge of the shelf to steady myself. It passed after a minute, but it left a cold sweat on my forehead. Pastor Ellen insisted I go to the clinic. I resisted, but eventually agreed. At the clinic, they checked my blood pressure, asked about my diet, my stress, my living situation. I told them the basics, left out the parts that would have taken too long to explain. The doctor looked me in the eye and said, "You need to rest, truly rest. Your body is not keeping up with the life you're trying to survive." I nodded, but deep down, I knew rest wasn't something people like me were afforded. The next night, I returned to the church and found a note slipped under my door. It was from Emily. It said, "Mom, I heard through Janice that you were at the church. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. I didn't know things had gotten that bad. I hope you're okay. I can't promise anything right now, but I'm thinking about you." There was no return address, no number, just her name. I held the note in my hand for hours, thinking about me. I tried to imagine her handwriting again, tried to picture her sitting at her kitchen table, writing those words. Did her hand shake? Did she hesitate before sealing the envelope? The next day, a man came to the church looking for food. He had 2 kids with him, both quiet, both with shoes that looked too small. I handed him a bag and he smiled, but his eyes were broken. I watched them walk away and felt something rise in my chest. Not pity, not sadness, but fire. I couldn't save them. I couldn't change their story, but I could choose what I did with mine. That night, I stayed up writing. Not letters, not prayers, but pages of my life. Stories I had never told, memories I had buried. I wrote about Emily's first steps, about James's last breath, about the silence of the cot and the cold of rejection. I wrote until my fingers cramped and my eyes blurred. And for the first time in months, I felt real. The truth is, I had been waiting for permission to exist, but no one gives you that. You have to take it back, one word at a time. It was a Tuesday evening when I realized I hadn't stepped outside in days. The walls of the church, once comforting, had begun to press in on me. The hallway lights flickered with that familiar hum, and even the smallest sounds, a cough, a door creaking, echoed louder than they should. My skin itched for air, for motion, for something different from this quiet that had started to feel like a second skin. I pulled on a coat that was too thin for the season, wrapped a scarf twice around my neck, and stepped out into the chill of early winter. The city felt different at night. The storefronts were closed, their neon signs off, casting everything in shadow. The sidewalks were wet from an earlier drizzle, reflecting the streetlights like little mirrors of another world. I walked with no destination, just the need to move, to feel the ground under me. After about an hour, my legs began to ache. I spotted a public bench near a park and sat down slowly. The metal was cold beneath me, but I didn't mind. The trees overhead swayed in the wind, their bare branches creaking like tired bones. I sat there, breathing in the night, when a smell drifted toward me. Something warm, something familiar. Soup, garlic, maybe onions. It was coming from the opposite side of the street, where a small food truck stood parked under a flickering lamppost. A man was serving bowls of soup to a small group of people. Most of them looked like me, faces weathered by time, clothes that had seen better days, eyes that carried stories no one had asked to hear. I crossed the street, slowly, cautiously, unsure if I belonged. The man behind the truck looked up and smiled. He had kind eyes and hands that moved with purpose. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "You hungry?" I hesitated. "I don't have any money." He waved his hand like that didn't matter. "First bowl's always free," he said with a wink, "especially if it's been a hard day." He handed me a paper cup filled with soup. It was hot, heavy in my hands, and smelled like something from a memory. I thanked him and found a spot on the curb to sit. The first sip was almost too much. Salt, warmth, something like comfort. I hadn't eaten all day, maybe not even the day before. The soup coated my insides like a blanket, and for a moment, I forgot how cold it was. As I ate, I listened. The people around me weren't loud, but they weren't silent either. Some talked about jobs they used to have. One man told a story about his dog that had passed last winter. Another woman sang softly under her breath, her voice cracked but sweet. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. When I finished, I brought the empty cup back to the man. He looked at me, really looked, the way people do when they see more than just your face. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" he asked gently. I nodded. "A church, down on 4th. He nodded back. "That's a good place. They helped my sister a few years ago." There was something in the way he said it, an unspoken understanding, a bridge between our different stories. He reached into the truck and handed me a brown paper bag. "Here," he said, "in case you get hungry later." I took it with both hands, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. It wasn't just the soup, it was the kindness. The unasked for, no strings attached kindness that people forget exists when you've been pushed out of the spaces that used to know your name. I walked back to the church slowly. The paper bag crinkled softly in my hand. Inside was another cup of soup, wrapped in foil to stay warm, and a small bread roll. Someone had tucked in a napkin, folded carefully, like a mother would do for her child. Back in my little room, I sat on the edge of the cot and opened the bag again, not to eat, but to hold it. To remind myself that I was still part of something human, that even strangers, even people with nothing to gain could choose to see you, to feed you, to remind you that you still mattered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, heart full of something I hadn't felt in so long I didn't know what to call it. It wasn't hope. Not exactly. It was quieter than that. Smaller. Like a match in a dark room. Enough to light a path, even if only for a few steps. In the days that followed, I kept walking. Not far, not fast, but enough to feel my body moving, my feet touching ground that wasn't tied to routine or duty. I started noticing things I had forgotten to see. The way the leaves curled at the edges when the frost came early. The way people held hands when they thought no one was watching. The smell of coffee from corner shops. The laughter of children whose voices pierced the noise of traffic like birdsong. One morning, I sat in the same park and watched a little boy chase pigeons while his mother scrolled through her phone. He didn't care that they flew away before he could catch them. He laughed like the joy was in the running, not the catching. I envied that. I had spent so many years trying to catch things, approval, safety, love, that I had forgotten how to just run. Later that afternoon, I returned to the church and found a small package by my door. It had no name, no note, just a knitted shawl in a deep, warm burgundy, soft as a whisper. I knew it had come from one of the congregation members, maybe even one of the quiet ladies who always brought extra biscuits on Sundays. I wrapped it around my shoulders and let myself be held. These small things, the soup, the shawl, the laughter of a child, began to stitch me back together. I started writing again, longer this time. I wrote letters I never sent. To Emily, to James, to myself. I wrote about the way grief hides in silence, about how loneliness can feel like drowning in a room full of air, about the strange way kindness feels heavier when you've gone so long without it. But I also wrote about strength, not the kind people admire in movies, the real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that gets you out of bed when your heart feels like glass. The kind that lets you offer a smile to someone else when you haven't been smiled at in weeks. The kind that says, "I am still here," even when no one is listening. One evening, I read one of those letters out loud during the women's group at church. My voice shook, my hands trembled, but I read every word. When I finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. One by one, the women stood and hugged me. Some cried. Some whispered, "Me too." In that moment, I understood something I had missed for so long. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't the only one carrying pieces of a broken past, trying to find a way forward. That night, as I lay down beneath the shawl, warm for the first time in days, I closed my eyes and didn't think about everything I had lost. I thought about what I was finding, and it wasn't a house. It wasn't a room of my own. It wasn't even forgiveness. Not yet. It was something softer. Something smaller, a place in the world where I was no longer invisible. The morning sunlight came through the small, dusty window in my little room behind the church pantry, cutting across the floor in thin golden stripes. I sat on the edge of the cot, holding a mug of weak coffee in my hands, the warmth seeping slowly into my fingers, trying to reach the parts of me that felt frozen. For the first time in what felt like decades, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's life on my shoulders, and I wasn't trying to be invisible. I was just existing, and that was enough. Pastor Ellen came in quietly, carrying a tray with another cup of coffee and a small plate of toast. She set it down gently, as if placing it somewhere sacred, and sat on the edge of the bed beside me. "You slept well?" she asked softly. Her eyes were kind, steady, and they held no judgment. For the first time in a long while, someone's gaze made me feel like a human being, not a task or a burden. I nodded, unsure if I believed her question. "I think so," I said, my voice raspy from sleep. I took a bite of the toast, the butter melting slowly, the bread slightly warm. It was nothing special, but in that moment, it tasted like the first taste of freedom I had ever had. I had forgotten that small pleasures could exist without strings attached. Later that morning, I found myself wandering toward the church kitchen, partly out of habit and partly because I didn't know what else to do. Ruth had returned from the hospital the day before, smiling but still fragile. She waved me over. "I have a task for you," she said, handing me a basket of vegetables that needed washing. There was no condescension in her voice, no pity, just a simple act of trust, of responsibility given without expectation. I washed the carrots and scrubbed the potatoes, listening to the rhythmic sounds of running water and the soft thud of vegetables hitting the cutting board. It reminded me of James, of Emily, of the countless hours spent preparing meals in my old home. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't doing it for someone else's comfort. I wasn't trying to earn love or approval. I was doing it because I could, because I wanted to feel capable again. The first person to notice the change was a young mother who came to pick up food for her children. Her name was Marlene. She had dark circles under her eyes and a weary look that mirrored mine more than I wanted to admit. I handed her the basket of cleaned vegetables, smiling gently. "Here you go," I said. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected to be treated with this level of care. And then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You have no idea what this means." I nodded and turned away, feeling a warmth inside that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was something deeper, like remembering a language I had forgotten I knew how to speak. Something about giving, about being useful without strings attached, made me feel whole again. Ruth and I worked together that day, sorting canned goods and preparing boxes for families. We didn't talk much about our pasts. Our hands moved in rhythm, and in that rhythm, I found a kind of peace. Each can placed, each box sealed, was a reminder that I could still contribute, that I still had value, not to Emily, not to the life I had lost, but to the world that still existed around me. By mid-afternoon, Pastor Ellen suggested I help sell the baked goods at the small market outside the church. I hesitated. I hadn't done something like that in decades. I worried I might be too slow, too clumsy, too old, but her eyes encouraged me, patient and unwavering. "Just go at your own pace," she said. "People will be happy to see you." So I went. I set up the little table, laid out the cornbread and sweet rolls, and waited. The first few customers came, nodding politely, paying with exact change, sometimes leaving $1 extra. They didn't know me, didn't care about my past, didn't ask for explanations, and that was liberating. There was no judgment in their eyes, just acknowledgement. A little girl came up to the table holding her mother's hand. She looked at me wide-eyed and pointed at the cornbread. "Is this homemade?" she asked. I smiled and nodded. She took a piece, broke it in half, and offered me a small, tentative smile. I had forgotten how powerful that small recognition could feel. The simple act of being seen, of being acknowledged, of existing in the world in a way that mattered to someone else. It was intoxicating. By the time I returned to the church, my hands were sticky with sugar and flour, my apron dusted with crumbs, my feet tired but my spirit lighter. I hung my apron carefully, washed my hands slowly, and sank into the chair by my little window. Outside, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky with gold and pink. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of being unwanted pressing down on me. I felt something else. Possibility. The quiet, delicate possibility of life not defined by abandonment, but by small acts of choice, kindness, and usefulness. That evening, I lit a candle on the small table by my bed. I didn't pray aloud, but I held the flame close to my chest and let it warm me. I thought about the families I had helped that day, the smiles I had received, the small gestures that reminded me that I still belonged somewhere beyond the rejection and silence, somewhere that wasn't measured by Emily's approval or lack thereof. And as the candle flickered softly, casting shadows on the walls, I realized that for the first time in a very long time, I could breathe without fear. I could exist without apology. I could be Dolores again, not the burden, not the ghost of a life I once had, but a woman with hands that could still create, a voice that could still comfort, and a heart that could still love. In the quiet of that room, with the candlelight dancing gently across the walls, I felt it, the first real hint of home, not a place, but a state of being, a fragile, tender home built not on someone else's acceptance, but on the quiet reclaiming of myself. Months passed after that first fragile sense of peace had settled into my life at the church. I kept to my routines, small yet steady, and found a rhythm I had long forgotten. I rose early, brewed coffee, dusted the shelves, organized the pantry, and prepared meals for anyone who came seeking comfort. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it reminded me that I still mattered. Every action, every gesture, was a small reclaiming of myself, a quiet protest against the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and discarded. One afternoon, as I was arranging canned goods on a high shelf, a knock came at the church door. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over. A woman stood there, holding a clipboard, her expression gentle but serious. "Are you Dolores Thompson?" she asked. I nodded slowly, unsure of why anyone from outside the church would be looking for me. "I'm from social services," she said. "We received a report regarding your situation. May we speak?" For a moment, my mind went blank. I had no idea what report. I had no idea who would have said anything. And then I realized, maybe someone had noticed. Maybe someone had understood the depth of what I had endured. Maybe, finally, someone cared enough to act. We sat together in the small office behind the church kitchen. She asked about Emily, about my living situation, about the years after James had passed. I told her everything. The small humiliations, the growing distance, the words that had cut deeper than any knife. "You're a burden." She listened, nodded, and made notes, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel her empathy, a steady presence that reminded me I wasn't invisible anymore. Weeks later, after forms and meetings and phone calls, she returned with news that shifted the landscape of my life. "We can help you," she said. "You have rights. You are entitled to protection. Abandonment of an elderly adult is a violation. We can ensure you're safe." I didn't know how to feel. Relief, yes, but also disbelief. Hope, yes, but also caution. I had been discarded before, promised one thing and given another. Could I trust that this time someone would truly stand with me? Emily was called in for a meeting. I saw her face as she walked into the office, the surprise, the guilt, the discomfort. She tried to explain herself, to say she had been overwhelmed, that she hadn't meant to hurt me. But the law doesn't measure intent in excuses. The law, and the social worker, demanded accountability. I listened quietly, my heart a tumult of emotions. Part of me wanted to run forward, to demand the love I had poured into her life for decades. Part of me wanted to retreat, to remain in the small cocoon of the church where nothing could reach me. But I stayed silent, because staying silent was a kind of power I hadn't had in years. The resolution came slowly. Emily was required to provide support and acknowledge her responsibilities. I was given access to resources I hadn't imagined. financial assistance, legal protection, medical support. But more than that, I was given something far more precious: the knowledge that I had survived, that my life mattered, and that I could finally exist on my own terms. I returned to the church that evening, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from a strange, exhilarating sense of liberation. Ruth and Pastor Ellen were there, as always, their eyes bright with warmth and welcome. I set down my bag and inhaled deeply. I could breathe again, truly breathe. That night, I lit the candle on the small table by my bed, the soft flame flickering against the walls. I thought about James, about Emily, about the long years of care and sacrifice, of loss and isolation. I thought about the soup on the park curb, the shawl left by a stranger, the hands that reached out when I was falling. I thought about the small lights that had guided me back to myself, one tiny moment at a time. I whispered a prayer, not for revenge, not for restitution, but for gratitude, for the people who had seen me when no one else did, for the quiet resilience that had carried me through, for the strength that had never left me, even when my body and heart were breaking. I whispered, "Thank you," over and over, until the words felt like something tangible, like a warm quilt wrapping around my soul. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe in a long time. I was free, not because the past had been erased, not because the wounds were gone, but because I had found a place within myself that no one could take. I had survived. I had endured, and I had reclaimed my life. I am Dolores Maria Thompson. I am a mother, a widow, a caretaker, a woman who was cast aside and yet found her way back to herself. I am strong, I am worthy, and I am here. I have built a life not defined by the cruelty of others, but by the quiet courage that refuses to be extinguished. To anyone who has ever felt invisible, unwanted, or abandoned, I want you to know this: your story is not over. The world may turn its back, but there are hands to hold you, lights to guide you, and a strength inside you that no one can take away. You are not a burden. You are not invisible. You are enough. And so I live. I breathe. I work. I love. I create. I tell my story, not for pity, not for judgment, but so that the world may know that even when we are pushed to the edge, even when our hearts are broken, the human spirit can endure. The human spirit can rise, and it can shine again. Thank you for walking with me through these words, for witnessing a life that refused to disappear. Thank you for holding space for the quiet strength of those who survive, for those who endure, for those who are still here. May you carry a piece of that strength with you, and may you always remember, even in the darkest times, light can return. Even in the deepest pain, hope can survive. And even when love is withheld, the capacity to love, your own heart, your own life, remains untouchable, indestructible, and endlessly yours.